Hi everyone. So in this video we will be dealing with the previous year questions of NTA NET English, and in this video we will be dealing with the questions that were asked for morning shift for December 2020, June 2021 cycles merged, and this would be from literary criticism. So here, as we have mentioned in the previous videos, in literary criticisms, the questions can be direct. At the same time, even though the questions can be direct, it can also be from in-depth. I mean, you can expect questions from the extracts, from passages. So the thing is that you have to understand the gist of the philosophy or the ideology said by these critics or these writers. So here in this video, we will be looking to the questions that were asked for December 2020, June 2021 cycles merged examination, and that too from morning shift. So let's begin with first question. What 19th century philosophical term of Russian origin did Friedrich Nietzsche use to describe the disintegration of traditional morality in Western society? What 19th century philosophical term of Russian origin did Friedrich Nietzsche use to describe the disintegration of traditional morality in Western society? So here, in this question, in this question, it has been asked, they have been given four options or four ideologies in which you have to identify the term proposed by Nietzsche in order to explain the 19th century, or in order to explain the 19th century disintegration of morality in Western society. So let's look at the options. Absolutism, anarchism, cynicism and nihilism. Absolutism, anarchism, cynicism and nihilism. So these are the options: absolutism, anarchism, cynicism and nihilism. So here, before answering this question, let's look at the options. So here we know that Nietzsche, he popularized the concept of nihilism. So for Nietzsche, there is no objective order or structure in the world except what we give it. Okay, so according to Nietzsche, the objective order of the world, it does not exist, and the order is something that we give to the world. It is not something that is inherent in the world. So penetrating the facades, buttressing convictions, the nihilist discovers that all values are baseless and that reason is important. So according to a nihilist, all values are baseless. Okay, be it morality, be it any of sorts of virtues or whatever it is, all values are baseless according to a nihilist, and the reason is important. So nihilism, it was not term coined by Nietzsche, but it was further discussed by Friedrich Nietzsche, and he used this term to describe the Western world's disintegration of traditional morality. So for Nietzsche, nihilism, it applied to both the what can we say, both the trends of both the modern trends of value and at the same time destruction. For example, we know about the concept death of the god given by him. So we can find, according to him, this nihilism, it can be applied to this modern trends of value destruction, which he expressed in the death of the god, as well as what he saw as the life denying morality. Okay, so here, according to him, nihilism, it can also be applied to this life denying morality of Christianity. So under Nietzsche's profound influence, the term, that is nihilism, it was further treated within French philosophy, then it moved to continental philosophy more broadly, and here you can find that Nietzsche, he calls pity the practice of nihilism. Okay, so nihilism or the nihilists, they practice pity, and it multiplies misery and converses all that is miserable, and is thus a prime instrument of the advancement of decadence. Pity persuades men to nothingness. Pity persuades men to nothingness. So that is what he calls the practice of nihilism. So a nihilist, he discovers all values are baseless and the reason is important, and at the same time, how nihilism is practiced, it is through pity. Okay, nihilism is practiced through pity. It multiplies the misery and conserves all that is miserable. So the prime instrument of the advancement of decadence is nihilism. So pity persuades men to nothingness. So let's go back to the question. question. So Nietzsche, he uses the term nihilism to describe the disintegration of traditional morality in Western society. So the correct answer is option D, that is nihilism. The correct answer is option D, nihilism. Now, I hope that's clear. Now, let's move on to the next question. In December 2020, June 2021 cycles merged morning shift. There was a question. This was another question from literary criticism. In an apology for poetry, Sidney discusses the didactic function of poetry by comparing it to philosophy and dash. In Apology for Poetry, Sidney discusses the didactic function of poetry by comparing it to philosophy and dash. So this is something that I have mentioned in all the classes of literary criticism. Philip Sidney and his defense of poetry, or an apology for poetry, is really important from a literary point of view, at the same time from a NET point of view. Okay, because there were numerous questions that were asked from Sidney and Sidney's apology for poetry. I think more than the literary works of Sidney, he has been asked repeatedly for NTA NET exams for his apology for poetry. So we have discussed that work in detail earlier. So in Apology for Poetry, we know that Sidney, he has written this essay as a response to the Puritan writer Stephen Gowson's School of Abuse, in which he opposes the use of poetry and by claiming that even Plato banished poets from his ideal world or from his republic. So here it is Sidney's defense of his poetry. Okay, so here you can find that in Apology for Poetry, Sidney compares poetry with history and philosophy. Okay, compares poetry to history and philosophy, and he says that poetry has two merits that overcome the other. Okay. Poetry has two merits that overcome the other. That is, it directly tells the reader universal truths. It directly tells the reader universal truths, and it is easily understandable with rhetorical figures. It is easily understandable with rhetorical figures. Okay, at the same time, history, it is all about facts, and the reader has to derive universal truths from it. So we know about history. For example, if we have studied about this Napoleon or Alexander the Great, everything, we study about the very factual details. For example, if we study about French Revolution, that's a historical description of the happenings of this French Revolution during that time. So here it is all about facts. It's all about facts, and the reader has to derive universal truths from it. Okay, it gives you facts, it gives you descriptions, it gives you details where you have to derive these universal truths from it. And this universal truths, it might depend on the one who wrote the history, one who won the history. And philosophy, it tells abstract concepts which is difficult to be perceived by young people. We also know that understanding philosophy or understanding philosophers, it is not that an easy job. For example, let's take the distinction between structuralism and post-structuralism. Okay, so post-structuralism, it is based on philosophy, and that itself gives you the incomprehensibility of deconstruction. So according to Sidney, philosophy tells about abstract concepts. It tells about truth, it tells about beauty, virtues and all, but it is difficult to be perceived by the young people. And these two difficulties, or these two shortcomings, are compensated through poetry, because poetry, it directly tells the people about the universal truths. You don't have to derive from it, and it is easily understandable. If something is difficult, they use the metaphors, they use the similes or any other figures of speech in order to make it more comprehensible. So with these two things, poetry has the merits that overcome history and philosophy. So the question was, in an apology for poetry, Sidney discusses the didactic function of poetry by comparing it to philosophy, and answer is option C, that is history. So the correct answer is option C, history. Now let's move on to the next question. Okay, this question has been asked from Virginia Woolf. So she belongs to the modern age of literary criticism. So this is again another question that was asked in the morning shift of December 2020, June 2021 cycles merged examination. So in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, Virginia Woolf. So you have to, as I said earlier, you have to, in order for you to answer the questions that are coming from literary criticism or that come from literary criticism, you have to understand the gist of each writer's, their ideologies, the works and the basic concepts that works the proposals. Okay, so that is how you could answer the questions of literary criticism. So here you can answer this question if you know what does Virginia Woolf says in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown. So in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, let's look at the option. Virginia Woolf analyzes the state of modern fiction by contrasting two generations of writers, criticizes book buying preferences of the educated English class, presents modernity as a stable and coherent project uniting all artists, responds to E.M. Forster's remarks on character in fiction. Okay, so these are the options. Analyzes the state of modern fiction by contrasting two generation of writers, criticizes book buying preferences of the educated English class, presents modernity as a stable and coherent project uniting all artists, responds to E.M. Forster's remarks on character in fiction. So let's look at the essay. So Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Woolf is an actually Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Woolf is Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown is an essay by Virginia Woolf, which was published in 1924, in which she explores modernity. So the writer Annal Bennett. So this is the reason why she has written Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown. So the writer Annal Bennett had written a review of Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, which was published in 1922 in a work called Castle's Weekly in March 1923. And this provoked Woolf to rebut it. So she recorded in her diary in June that Bennett accused her of writing about characters that couldn't survive. So in this particular criticism of Jacob's Room, Annal Bennett accuses Virginia Woolf of creating characters that could not survive. So in Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, she is actually trying to bring the contrast between the writings of Virginia Woolf and Annal Bennett. So Woolf addresses what she sees as the arrival of modernism. According to Virginia Woolf, Annal Bennett is not a modern age writer. He belongs to this late Victorian age or early modern age writer. He is not the product of modernism. Okay, so Woolf here, she addresses what she sees as the arrival of modernism and the changes that come with the advent of modernism. Okay, and the changes that come with the advent of modernism. And these changes, it happens in human relations, in religion, in conduct, in politics, and in literature. So these changes are there everywhere. So her argument is that when time changes, writers and the tools that they use, it should also evolve. So Virginia Woolf, she wrote mainly after the First World War, and when time changes, she cannot take the tools, or she cannot take the characters or narrative patterns or techniques of the previous generation. So when time changes, writers and the tools that they use, it must evolve. So the tools of one generation are useless to the next. So we cannot compare the writings of one generation with the writings of other and claim one generation is better than the other. So that is what she mentions in this essay. So here we know that by looking at the options, we know the correct answer is option A. She analyzes the state of modern fiction by contrasting two generations of writers. She brings the contrast between the Edwardian writers and the Georgian writers. Okay, so the correct answer is option A. Now let's look at the next question. According to Longinus, which two of the following qualities apply to great poetry? According to Longinus, which two of the following qualities apply to great poetry? So let's look at the option. So we know about Longinus, we know about On the Sublime. So here you have to understand what according to him, which two of the qualities according to him apply to great poetry. It must be the work of genius and inspired person. It must cause a feeling of melancholy in the reader. It must employ devices of rhetoric. It must please selectively and on special occasions. Okay, it must be the work of a genius and inspired person. It must cause a feeling of melancholy in the reader. It must employ devices of rhetoric. It must please selectively and on special occasions. So these are the options. So before that, let's look on the sublime. So Longinus and he's on the sublime. So in this work, he examines he examines the qualities that a good work want or a work want in order to achieve the sublimity. So sublimity is nothing but making a work extraordinary from the other works, making a work achieve its excellence. That is what is called as sublime. So according to him, the true features, or according to him, the features of true sublime is grandeur of thought, noble diction, dignified word arrangement, capacity for strong emotions, figures of speech and thought. Grandeur of thought, noble diction, dignified word arrangement, capacity for strong emotions, figures of speech and thought. So with these in mind, let's look at the options. According to Longinus, which two of the following qualities apply to a great poetry? So it must be the work of a genius, an inspired person. So that's a correct answer, because only a genius or an inspired person has this grandeur of thought. Okay, he has this grandeur of thought. And it must cause a feeling of melancholy in the reader. That's not mentioned. It must employ devices of rhetoric. Yeah, figures of speech and thought are very important in achieving this sublimity. So A and C are the correct answers. So A and C comes as option A. So the correct answer is option A. So now let's look at the next question. This is a question from T.S. Eliot. So T.S. Eliot is again another much important writer when it comes to NTA NET exam. So in December 2020, June 2021, cycles merged, there was a question from T.S. Eliot. So let's look at the question. In the function of criticism, T.S. Eliot attacked J. Middleton Murray and similar critics for being devotees of what he called the inner voice, the muse's mystery, the romantic impulse, and the simple hunt. The inner voice, the muse's mystery, the romantic impulse, and the simple hunt. So let's look at the work. So the function of criticism. So the function of criticism is an essay written by T.S. Eliot in response to J. Middle. The thing is that at first T.S. Eliot has written this essay called Tradition and Individual Talent. And some of the points that T.S. Eliot mentioned in Tradition and Individual Talent was challenged by this critic called J. Middleton Murray in his essay Romanticism and Tradition. Okay, so the function of criticism is again another response from T.S. Eliot to J. Middleton Murray's essay Romanticism and Tradition. I think that's clear. So the essay was written in response to J. Middleton Murray's essay Romanticism and Tradition, in which he disputes some of the ideas put forward by T.S. Eliot in Tradition and Individual Talent. So Murray, it seems he had said, men must obey their inner voice. Men must obey their inner voice, and this inner voice was not something that was appreciated by T.S. Eliot. So T.S. Eliot, he criticizes Murray and similar critics by claiming that anyone who values criticism cannot do so if they believe in this inner voice. So the inner voice, Eliot says, has liberal and weak properties or weak characteristics, and he calls them as vigorous. Okay, he calls them as vigorous. So Eliot replies that the inner voice sounds remarkably like an old principle which had been formulated by an elder critic in the now familiar phase of doing as one likes. So according to him, writing as per listening to the inner voice is not something that is challenging. It's not something that is fit to the modern world. It's like writing something that does not challenges anything, or writing something as per everyone's likes. So Eliot's purpose of criticism is to look for universal guidelines for elevating artistic creations, and this is not something that can be achieved if the writers write as per their inner voice. So let's look at the options. So the correct answer is option A, that is inner voice. So these were the questions that were asked in December 2020, June 2021 cycles merged morning shift. So here we have discussed the questions that were asked from Longinus, T.S. Eliot, Sidney, Virginia Woolf, and other major writers. So let's as I said earlier, while you are studying literary criticism, make sure you understand the gist of each and every work, because that is how the questions normally gets. So anyway, that's all about this video. Thank you.